Snow at Heaven's Edge. Chapter 9. Trepidation fell onto Xiaoyan, almost as if her entire existence had crystallized into this very moment. It was unbearable, and she felt 16 years of stifling all at once. She was going mad. The weather was hurling her into it, and she longed to return to the small cottage that had been her father's on the outskirts of the city. She missed them, and suddenly the isolation and loneliness, feelings she thought she was accustomed to, emotions which she thought were conquered and dead, had come back. An old familiar fear came with it. She was afraid of grief. She knew what the people in town were capable of, as they had demonstrated it before. Was this the pinnacle of their cruelty? Would they dare do something so outlandish simply to see her suffer? Despite the cold, she left the room and went into the courtyard, where the blistering storm pelted the open air with its white fury. Was nature always so angry? In the summer, Wuzheng was a harsh desert. Crops failed, and most of the food substance came from the merchants who brought them in from afar. Only useless things like flowers bloomed. There was a small pasture, but aside from that, most were just small gardens that could hardly be called farmland. She had never left the city, though she heard from others that there were many other cities throughout the Middle Empire. She wondered whether it was the same everywhere, and almost instantly she thought of asking Li Xiang. Her mood soured further, but then a voice startled her. "I've heard the little scamp had gone missing. It's always the same, huh? Curse of the ghost face." The man laughed and regretted it. That damned headache returned. He tried to soothe his bandaged head with his hands. Anger supplanted merriment from a few moments ago. He sneered. "Why don't you just die? Life is so hard here in this damned border town anyway. Why do you Fengs have to make it even harder? Why?" Jianshan was teary-eyed, but looked more contemptible than pitiful. He was far from finished with his rambling. "Now you conspire with that whore, an outsider, against us, you cheap slut." His voice splintered with passion as his face darkened with hate. "You should go join your sister." He had aimed the final jab right at Feng Xiaoyan's heart, but he did not expect the severity of her reaction. She lunged for his face like an angry cat. Caught off guard, Jianshan initially retreated, but once the shock subsided, he remembered his own physical superiority. Rage at her defiance and anger over her despicable pedigree made San burn with loathing. He grabbed her hair and held her back, then backhanded her. He followed with a kick to her abdomen, and then another to her chest, and sent her heaving. She was winded, lying like a fish out of water whose mouth tried vainly to suck in air. "Not feeling so strong now," Jiang taunted. "Your sister has much softer flesh." He slammed his giant fist into his empty palm, making a smacking sound. Xiaoyan saw that the man had no intent of letting this just pass, and she scanned the horizon for an escape. "Not feeling up to it anymore?" the man said, blocking her path. She heard the hubbub of chatter down in the common area, but the rooms in the vicinity were deadly silent. She wanted to scream, but who would come to her aid? She gritted her teeth and braced herself for another attempt. If only... He caught her hair and dragged her to the ground. The snow absorbed part of the impact, but it was still hard enough to hurt and stun. He waited for her to recover her senses before kicking her again. She twisted onto her side, holding her abdomen as she coughed up spit and bile. Xiaoyan did not get up, but crawled away, backing into the far edge of the courtyard. He dragged her up, punched her again, and she slid down the wall. He pulled her up by her hair. He punched her, kicked, and punched her again. She was a dazed, bruised mass, barely human. Jianshan straddled her, his large frame suffocating her as his hands slapped her continuously. Then they found something more dangerous, her neck. They slid around it, cutting off circulation and air. Xiaoyan flailed and scratched at him, but he was as firm and as moving as Mount Tai. Her fists pounded fruitlessly on his muscular frame. She knew there was not much time as she began to fade. If not in this life, then perhaps in death, she would haunt him. She glared at his face, memorizing every detail so that when she died, her spirit would come back for vengeance. Through the faint light, she caught a glimpse of the ornamental pin holding his top knot. His was too high to reach, but not hers. A wide, jagged smile stretched across her face, and she saw Jianshan's surprised reaction, which turned into shock, and then pain as she punctured him. She felt the blood, hot and sticky, squirt, drip, and flow onto her hand and face. He did not let go, and she kept jabbing. He kept hearing the soft, slushy sound each time the pin pierced the meaty flesh. Even as he fell onto her, she did not stop. She did not think she could ever stop. until finally the pin lodged itself deep within a fragment of bone and broke. She pushed him off and knelt on top of the body, staring at the bloodied, frayed mess. Her hands trembled and her lips quivered. The chill that she felt froze her blood, but her heart pumped frantically anyway. She panted and waited for the blizzard to cover them both. He had reached deep and grabbed, not her neck, but the monster that lay asleep and hidden in the darkest recesses of her soul, and jolted it awake. There was no way to put it to rest, not when it had its fill of blood and vengeance. She closed her eyes, feeling this blackness rise. The wind moaned, but it did not blow away her past suffering nor assuage her present pain. It spoke to her in that mournful way that touched her deeply and reached so far into the past that heightened her emotions. She felt a cold indifference toward all else. There were things that were unbearable and unforgivable. She would make them remember. Although killing Jansan did not soften her pain, it added a pleasure of its own, the sort of relief that comes with feeling the cool outdoor air on her skin after suffocating in a hot, stuffy room, or the satisfaction of unburdening herself of the firewood after a sail. This was similar, only more intense. Seren felt herself stand, brushing off the powdery snow from a large rock. She saw her hands lift and come down onto the dead man's head in a soft, wet plump. Her frozen, numbed face smiled as she watched her arms rise again, but a hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Let me tell you what to do next," a male voice said. She thought she nodded in response, and then let her arms fall violently down. The Mas pushed open the half-closed double doors, expecting an ambush, but finding none. "Father! Nanying!" Ma Wunyang screamed as she dived toward the armored bodies on the ground, turning each one over and trying futilely to find her kin amongst them. They were not all soldiers and guards. There were servants, unarmed men and women, and children. Ma Xiande had seen this before and cared little for it, save the question. Who? His thoughts turned to his enemy. Had he escaped, and was he still alive? The idea was as revolting as the slaughter. She continued to move from one to the next, no longer in the realm of the present. What went wrong? Had they not agreed to a truce? She regretted ever going away. The flask of monkey wine was still hot, but so was the blood of her brother that made rivulets across the marble floor of the main hall. The surreal image of her father, his head hanging by threads of muscle and strands of vessels and nerves, could not be purged from her memory. She shrieked, frightened by the sight and frustrated at her own inability to find what she knew were there, the bodies of her father and brother. Ma Xiande could not afford to have her wandering off. He swiftly sealed several pressure points, inducing a sleepy calm in his wife. He placed her softly on the ground. He knew that she was reliving that nightmare once more. The tragedy was what joined them now. The same recurrent scene of his garments drenched in blood, and his sword plunged deep into the abdomen of Liao Nanying. He had returned that night after spending an entire day deliberating his conflicted duties. In the end, his vow to Ma Wunyang surpassed all others. She had entrusted her life to him. At that moment, he had already given up. The duel had been nothing more than a perfunctory act for him to soothe his guilt and release his anger. All that was left for the hollowed man was to return to his wife, to hold, kiss, and lie with her. The dirt path changed before him into the well-paved road leading to the luxurious villa he had come to call home for the past year. And yet the sight and sound were so foreign. Not a sentry was in sight, and the doors that were closed stood open. Bodies in all mannerism of dismemberment scattered about like the dark autumn leaves. His wound bled anew, mixing his blood with those of the dead man. A lone Gekker disturbed the dead silence. His sword unsheathed stuck to his left hand. The once elegantly long verandas and wide-open courtyards now seemed foreboding and made him feel vulnerable. Many of the doors were off their hinges, and blood clung to paper panels and walls like moss. A night owl hooted. Ma Xiande wondered whether it was mourning for the lost souls or here to collect them. He went through several more quarters, all similarly gory and differed only in the number of slain. The Gekker turned to a horrible wet gagging sound that increased in intensity as he neared. He had expected to see a fox spirit or some angry ghost devouring one of the hapless bodies when he saw Liao Nanying. Blood flowed from his orifices like water from a creek. His face was masked in red as he choked up globs of half-coagulated blood. He was poisoned. Several deep cuts crossed his arms and legs. Xiande hurried to his side, dropping his sword, and lifted the injured Nanying with his one good arm. Liao Nanying coughed up mouthfuls of blood and willed his way through the pain to speak. "You must take sister away. Hide. The government no longer trusts us." The young man's eyes were dilated and losing focus, and they constricted only with each spasm of pain that again caused him to cough up more blood. Xiande tried to answer, but saw that Nanying was no longer capable of hearing. A profound sorrow loomed over him. Was fate so sudden and unexpected? He had anticipated a cold, perhaps awkward homecoming, but never to the slaughter of an entire clan. Nanying gagged and turned to his side to spit up more black blood. His nails clawed uselessly at the marble floor. Ma Xiande's eyes met his brother-in-law's for the last time, and he knew what Nanying wanted to say. In that moment, he could only think of the man in his arms as a cheerful boy who loved his father and his sister, and thought the world kinder, simpler, and gentler than it really was. The boy was a better man than him, and death always takes the better man. Ma Xiande rested Nanying onto the floor. He picked up his sword and placed the tip over his brother-in-law's heart that was furiously working at pumping the poison throughout his vigorous young body and slowly dissolving him from the inside. The pained expression on Nanying's face eased when the young man felt the sharpness and weight of the sword tip. He nodded and then closed his eyes, never to open them again, not even when the blade entered, tearing through his ribs and the four chambers of his muscular heart in an expert thrust. The summer heat condensed the sanguineous atmosphere and filled the air with rot. Ma Xiande wanted to vomit, and probably would have, were it not for his wife's piercing scream. She ran to her brother's side, but he was long gone. She stared at her husband. His long sword was buried deep within her brother's chest, and he wore the wounds of Nanying's flying daggers. She growled and bared her teeth like an angry beast. Between one breath and the next, Ma Wunyang lunged at him. She kicked and slapped the unmoving man. What transpired was his fate, his worst nightmare coming true despite his best efforts to avoid it. Tears spilled forth from his anguished heart as he tried to crawl away like some wounded animal. She gave him one powerful kick to the ribs, then slipped and fell. He rolled over, breathing air that he did not think he deserved until a familiar feeling returned. Find the culprit. Wunyang? She stood with a small sword that dangled loosely from her hand. She looked in his direction, but not at him. Her eyes were wide and her face pale. He turned to see the ghastly corpse of Liao Wenjing, who was not merely slain, but desecrated. A loud clang startled Ma Xiande. His wife fell unconscious on the floor. He wanted to run to her, but something stayed his legs. A loud whistle sounded and Ma Xiande leapt backwards. 3 needles struck the far wall in rapid succession. Men with white faceless masks flooded the room. He slew a few and forced the fight outside to keep his wife from harm. Only a handful of faceless men remained, but Ma Xiande was wounded and worn. They circled him, looking for an opening, each taunting the other into a rash attack. "Master Ma!" The Frau voice belonged to housekeeper Cai Yi. The short, bloodied man tumbled into Ma Xiande's arm and fell to his knees. "Please avenge our great general's death. They... It's alright, brother Cai. Just stand behind me." He thought about asking the man to carry Wunyang to safety, but a sharp pain to his ribs quickly dissuaded that thought. He looked down and saw a knife between his ribs. In anger, he swatted the man away. "Kill him!" the traitor shouted. Ma Xiande was in no position to fight any longer, and he dashed into the hall and whisked away his wife. He felt as if he had been running and carrying her ever since. Hunted by the Imperial Guards, he vowed vengeance on the traitor, who had cleverly eluded him by hiding north and usurping the surname of the family he betrayed. And for what? Money and power that could only be wielded at a barren wasteland at the edge of the world? The indignity of discarding one's own identity? He stared once more at the dismembered body. This time, it was that of the older and much rounder Cai Yi, or as he preferred, Liao Dengmao. By the contorted look on his face, the frightened wide-eyed stare, the downward curve of the lips, and slightly parted mouth and crinkled chin, the traitor had suffered. Ma Xiande expected disappointment and found relief. Yet his body was not any more mutilated than the rest. Who else would have harbored such hatred? Had the two parties fallen out of favor and ended in a mutually annihilative fight? "Have you come to take me with you, father?" his wife asked in a calm, childlike voice. "Wunyang, do you see someone?" "Father, Nanying, Old Wu, and Xingxing." Everyone's coming, she giggled. And I'm going. And you're going too. She was partially right. Ma Xiande sensed a very heavy aura of death lingering around the mansion. Wu! A blur of grayish-white darted at them, and Wu Niang yelled. Xiande kicked the spear in its general direction, changing its path and opening a route for them to escape. He could still leap and run despite his aging and injured body. In one bound, the couple landed on the snow-padded tiles off the high wall. Another jump took them outside of the compound as they fled down the mountain path. Ma Xiande glanced at his wife to make sure she was uninjured. She had on a flat, expressionless face. Reassured, he checked for pursuers and saw no one. He knew they were following, and sooner or later would catch up. He held his wife's hand tighter and increased their pace. Mao Niang glared at him. "Murderer," she said. A large expanse of flatland surrounded Wuchang, beyond which were mountainous canyons and deep valleys. Several small hills jutted from the landscape like frozen waves. A cluster of cottages huddled close to the city and belonged to 24 or so farming families and outcasts. Lin Ruting had visited their houses, surprising them with her audacity for traveling in the midst of such a storm. She now stood alone and lost in the cold darkness. Her surveying the previous day proved extremely low yield in the near whiteout condition. Where is Li Xiang? Is she safe? Is Wu Gege safe? She was torn between logic and emotion, to go or to stay. The storm proved too much, and she was forced to pay 2 ingots of silver, one for a night's stay at a family storage room, and the other the right to the firewood. It was expensive, but she needed both, and kept the furnace burning. She had lain down to unbind her tight thoughts when a strange feeling arose. Her hand instinctively fell to her sword. "Lady Lin," an unfamiliar voice called. "I am Gao Ming. I met Miss Li Xiang." She immediately let him in, but her hopeful visage turned to disappointment when she saw that he was alone. The young stranger recounted his earlier encounter with her friends. He had come to offer her assistance. Ruting thanked him, but she wondered whether it was not already too late. "Do not worry, Lady Lin. She has heaven's blessing." Having gotten control of her feelings, Ruting chastised herself for being careless. The man was a guest at the inn. She recognized his face. His tone was awfully sincere, but also unnaturally optimistic. His mannerism was respectful, deferential almost, but they belied an air of pride. Did he or didn't he know her whereabouts? He carried no sword, yet she felt a sharp blade pointing at her. "You must be from around this area," she said. Is that a statement or a guess? A passerby would not have such a keen sense of direction in this weather, even if they were following me. He smiled, acknowledging her meaning. "I have stayed in the area for a short while, a long time ago." His face shone like a child recollecting the taste of sweets. "It was not winter when I was here." "Are you not afraid of the cold?" "There are things more terrifying than the cold." Ruting thought she saw a shadow flickered over his face, but just as swiftly his countenance reverted to the demure, reverential young man. "Brother Lin's sword, for example," he added. Ruting felt uneasy, but did not let it show. "Only the evil and the dishonest need fear my husband's sword. So naturally, a hero like Master Gao need not be afraid." "Then I would be much obliged if Lady Lin would put in a good word for me." Their conversation was always formal, and he touched upon various topics. She was impressed by his knowledge, but his style of speech and manner of transition were unnatural. When he spoke, he did so with neither passion nor conviction, almost as if he never had an opinion or took a side. Did he not want to, or was he simply indifferent? As she laid to rest once more, she reminded herself to sleep lightly and silently hoped that the storm would abate with the coming dawn. She was still away, and part of him wanted her to return. He was anxious either way and did not notice the large, lion-head general approach. "Innkeeper?" Speaker's deep tone more than made up for his brevity of words. "Yes, my lord," Chen Daming replied meekly. "There are 2 men, Feng Kai and Tang Ming. Have you seen them?" He knew the answer, but he pretended to labor for a minute. "No, my lord." "One is an older man, about 40, the other a youthful lad." Again, Daming worked intensely, though he already knew where Lai Ye and Gao Ming stayed, what floor and room. "There are 2, one older and one younger, but they go by other names." Lionhead ignored the comment and demanded, "Where are their rooms?" "The western chambers, third room on the left." The general already had his back to him when Innkeeper Chen added, "They're not there." General Wei rolled his large eyes. Chen Daming thought he would bellow, but instead he spoke with restraint. "What do you mean, Innkeeper?" Chen Daming could not stop the shaking in his hands, and he thought his life would end shortly at the hands of this large man. He managed to master his voice enough to give an answer. Mr. Fan had been gone all day, and Mr. Tang was still here until a while ago. "What about Ma Xiande and Ma Wunyang? Do you know of these two?" "My lord, they were here. Both left earlier this morning." Lionhead did not seem perturbed, but rather relieved by the news. He spoke the next words in a much softer tone, like he was talking to himself. "Then they won't ever again return." The general stared down the smaller man and asked, "What about the Lins, a young couple? Where are they?" "Neither they nor the child that was with them came back this morning." One of the general's lieutenants grabbed the innkeeper by his lapel and dragged him halfway over the counter. "General Wei, I think this old man has been lying all along. Perhaps a little pain would straighten him out." Daming trembled and kept his eyes closed, awaiting the worst. "Perhaps they'll kill me, and that'll be it." The thought of death and the pain of parting with his famous inn along with the cache of valuables within his secret chambers drove a dagger through his heart. "My poor singer." "Please," he mumbled, "I'm not lying. Ask anyone here." The room had been silent since the small contingent of soldiers entered. None dare speak for fear of drawing unwanted attention to themselves. Fighting another civilian, even against a strong one, is still much less terrifying than antagonizing a representative of the Mei government. Some men like to see others cower before them. They wield fear as a weapon to accomplish their end. General Wei was such a person. At the present, the most important matter was to establish control. "Let him go. We'll wait out the storm here," Lionhead said. The man bowed respectfully, but when he turned to address the general populace, his tone quickly became overbearing. "Where is the village chief and local magistrate?" No one volunteered the information until the guard directly interrogated one of the men. "Bring everyone here," the general commanded. The soldiers made their obeisance and went out amidst the heavy snowfall. Innkeeper Chen sunk into his large oak chair behind the wooden counter. Even the chatty An Dahuan found it prudent to be inconspicuous and seated himself quietly in the back corner. In the past, entire villages, suspected of harboring fugitives or conspiring against the government, had disappeared along with their citizens. Only distant travelers with long memories remembered what new maps had left out. Each person was undoubtedly thinking the same thought as many pairs of watchful eyes followed the soldiers' every movement. Slowly, sleepy-eyed children and their weary parents entered the inn. The old village chief, with cane in hand, stepped in lackadaisically. He said a greeting, but in a small, quivering voice that was devoid of authority, and reviewed the frail, aged man underneath. "Old man, don't be afraid. Answer truthfully and no harm will come to you or your people." The bushy-bearded general looked around the room. There were 45 people in total. "Are these all of Wucheng's residents?" "No, General. There were originally 82, but after several deaths from illnesses and 2 murders," the chief paused to gauge Lionhead's reaction and saw not the slightest hint of interest. But he continued anyway, lest he displeased the general. "We now number 74. But there are about 30 or more in small cottages living outside the city." Another group of townsfolk entered, including the women from the Spring Flower Pavilion, which attracted more than a few stares. "Who are the residents and who are the guests?" General Wei asked. "You should know, right?" Yes," mumbled the old village chief. The general nodded to his lieutenant, who started to yell orders. "Residents, move to the back. Guests, come to the front." In a more reverent voice, the lieutenant asked, "General Wei, should we round up those beyond the wall?" "There's no need for that now." He looked at the segregated crowd and asked the village head, "What do you make of this?" Chen Jing stared at the 12 men near the front of the room. He knew only a few of them by name, but none of them by history. "They're not local," he replied. "And those?" The general gestured to the rest with a wave of his hand. "My lord, they are our people." Wei Qingren approached the line of men in front, examining the face, the body type, and the subtle movements of each. He walked around them several more times before sitting down. Not satisfied, he asked the chief again. "Anyone recently moved to the town?" "No, sir." "A year ago?" No, sir. The most recent was a purchase by Madame Xiao 2 years ago. Oh, the lieutenant swiftly commanded. Madame Xiao, please come forward. The middle-aged woman prostrated herself on the ground while whimpering. Your humble servant wishes nothing more than to serve her lord. Come, he said, as she scurried over on hands and knees to where he sat. I just want to know which of your girls was a recent purchase. The madam nodded nervously and shouted, Pao Xiang, come greet General Wei. The lithe young girl came up and similarly prostrated herself. Lift your head, the general commanded. You know the government is very much against such despicable and immoral practices. His voice was stern, not angry, but Madame Xiao quaked like a feverish invalid, while Pao Xiang bowed her head low as tears rained like a spring shower. General Wei stood up, and the brothel mistress quickly flattened herself to the ground. Take this girl into one of the empty rooms. Take him, Lion had said, and pointed to one of the 12 men in the front row, to the storage room. Keep an eye on the rest, and now question each in turn. Soldiers took away Pao Xiang and the men. Madame Xiao shuffled back into the safety of the masses, and Chen Jing, by virtue of his age and stature, had a chair to sit. Innkeeper Chen stared empty-eyed at what had become of his inn. His gaze settled on the worn, frightened face of the village chief, and wondered whether he or anyone else knew that Xing was missing. He shook his head. No one would care. Ling Wuai slept little that night as he recalled Chen Kong's cryptic words. Chen Kong expounded Dharma as well as he explained the way of the sword or the ways of the world for that matter. They were all one. His wisdom is definitely like his name, infinite void, boundless. Wuai held the impulse to ask Chen Kong from where he had come and with whom he had studied. Such shallow questions were of little merit. He thought about many other things too. Such was the impact of an unexpected encounter with a sage like Chen Kong. When morning came, Wuai had slept but a few hours. The fire was a dying smoldering waste. The old man was nowhere in sight. In his stead was a small package that Ling Wuai deduced to be a book by its weight and shape. He read the note tied to the package. To further Hero Lin's understanding, Ling Wuai slipped the book into his breast pocket. A small offering of dried rice cakes laid on the altar of the enlightened being. This gesture was more than a religious act, but a practical custom throughout the Central Plains. The food was a gift to lost and weary travelers. Ling Wuai took a piece and clasped his palms together in thanks. He wondered how many travelers and townsmen had come to worship in front of this statue, but never thought about what the enlightened being's wooden form represented. They cared only for themselves, for their own wishes and prayers to come true. He bowed once more in gratitude and said to no one in particular, Thank you for sharing your lodging with me. The worst of the storm seemed to have passed as the clouds were lighter, and the weak sun smiled faintly through. Round balls of snow continued to descend, but they did so leisurely. The wind too lost its fury, and blew in sporadic gusts. Even nature worked within the ebb and flow of a greater karmic cycle. Ling Wuai admired the infinite wisdom of the enlightened being's words. Every beginning has an end, and every end had a beginning. He traveled fast, and the speed kept him warm. Every now and then he would stop and peer into a small cave or various hollows. The large northwestern Chuantian Dao, or Heaven's Pass, was the only break across the mountain range. Troves of icicles collected on the underbellies of the overhanging rocks that stretched their long necks as if trying hard to reconnect what was once whole. Ling Wuai went on, occasionally clutching his chest when a particular spasm gripped him too tightly, but he never stopped. Nothing bothered him more than not knowing where Li Xiang was. No one could have traveled as far as him, especially with a small child in this weather. No horses could scale this mountain path. He went back toward the town again. This time, he went through the wooded areas, places where people can find shelter from the storm. As he tore through the trees like the winter wind, Wuai noticed two small figures running ahead of him. The man turned his head, and Ling recognized him. Brother Ma, he shouted as he leapt in front of them, surprising the man with his burst of speed. Hero Lin, Ma Xiande replied. We must go. His countenance and tone of voice troubled Wuai. What's the matter? We must go, Xiande repeated. Although Ling Wuai thought it best to follow the man's advice, he was hesitant to leave without inquiring about Li Xiang. The child who was with me has gone missing, been abducted. Have you seen her? Ma Xiande shook his head and then turned to check on his wife. She was gesturing and self-dialoguing. Brother Lin, it is not safe here. We must return to the city at once. Ma Xiande's voice was most urgent now. If it is soldiers or imperial guards, I'll dispatch them, said Ling Wuai, who sounded rather impatient himself. No, they... Lin Wuai drew his sword and parted the white blur that came rapidly toward them. Run! Ma Sanlin needed no further urging. He and Ma Wuniang sprinted ahead. 4 figures stood around Lin Wuai, one in each direction to box him in. They demanded his full attention. Before he could make out their faces, 2 zoomed ahead after the Ma's. Lin Wuai followed, knowing he had 2 men chasing him. When he neared one of the white figures, Wuai slashed at him and then at the other man. The sword caught the light and flashed like lightning and tolled like a bell when it struck. He trapped them with his continuous attacks. The 4 men were dressed in white prisoners' garb. Their hair hung loosely about them. Their faces were ghastly pale, though their lips were bloody red. 2 were armed with government-issued broad sabers, undoubtedly taken from the commanders they killed, while the other 2 carried an axe and a chain dart. At first they stood still. Then they began to sway to some imaginary breeze. Lin Wuai had difficulty tracking their movements, and in that moment they spread out and charged at him. He parried the chain dart and somersaulted backwards before thrusting at the axeman to his right. An incoming slash forced Wuai to change mid-thrust into a defensive block. He transitioned to a downward cut and forced his opponent to retreat. The chain dart flew at his head. Lin Wuai dodged to his right and leapt at the assailant only to pivot at the last moment to avoid another saber attack. The exchange of sword and saber rang like a series of temple bells, but Wuai was more agile and slashed the man's arm. A loud whistling came from behind, and he fell to his left as a chain dart pierced the trunk of an adjacent tree. He feigned an attack on the neighboring axeman, but lunged at the man with the saber. The man was the weakest of the 4, and Wuai intended to cut him down first. His speed caught the man off guard, and his opponent retreated, but Wuai hounded him. The onslaught forced the man further back until they were isolated. Wuai stepped to the left and then spun to the right. The saber cleaved down, whooshing through the air, while the sword slid through the man's heart. Wuai ran into the thicker parts of the leafless forest and scaled a tree, luring any one of the 3 to follow. The X-Men ascended the tree after him, only to find his target diving toward him with sword aimed at his throat. The 2 tangled in an aerial exchange of sword slashes and axe cuts, but the axe was heavy and not suited for quick changes in direction. As soon as the X-Men parried Qinghe, the sword slashed back. The constant clash with the legendary blade and forceful back and forth motion proved too much for the instrument, and the X-blade fell from its handle. Qinghe sliced cleanly through the throat of the X-Man. Weapon and man fell onto the thick snow. The chain dart whizzed through the air. Lin Wuai ran in a circle around the chain dart wielder. Sparks exploded all around as the weapon failed to find its mark. The dense woods had eliminated lateral sweeps and any whipping maneuvers, limiting the attacks to straight throws. He slowed enough to bait the attacker into a careless throw. When he heard the familiar whistle, Wuai moved off the center line. Between one breath and the next, he charged, knowing the man was now defenseless. The sword stroke was fast and precise, and the man dropped silently onto the soft snow. Only the saberman remained. Lin Wuai expected the man to flee, but to his surprise, the saberman walked up to him and assumed an offensive stance. "Who are you? Why are you after the Mas? Explain yourself." Lin Wuai did not expect an answer, and he got none. The saberman opened with a diagonal cut that Lin Wuai parried. He followed with a kick that knocked the man off balance, and he pointed the tip of Qinghe at the man's throat. "Answer me!" The man did not speak, but his intent was obvious in his eyes even before he swung the saber again. Wuai acted, and the tip of the blade pierced the man's neck. These white-garbed men carried nothing on them but scars from torture. Their faces were sallow and aged, and even in death, none betrayed any emotion. The walk back to Wuchang provided him time to collect his thoughts. If an adversary had Li Xiang, then she would be safe as a hostage. They would not hurt her until they had him. The thought brought a measure of relief. As long as it's not them. Men like the ones he had encountered were despicable and dangerous. He recalled the look in their eyes during combat. These men killed because that was the only moment when they felt alive. Hey, you've made it to the end. If you like it so far, please subscribe and like. This lets me know I'm on the right path. And if you can't wait for the next installment of Snow at Heaven's Edge, then head on over to Amazon and read the story in its entirety for free if you have Kindle Unlimited. Alternatively, you can check out Dreamweaver and Duo on Mount Taiyuan as well. Both of these stories are done and available for free here on YouTube, Spotify, and Audible. If you want to support me, please consider going to my Ko-fi and being a member. Have a great day.